All right, now let's look at the Cold War's impact on other aspects of American society and the government, so on and so forth. This is a good sentence at the top of this slide. Cold War policies led to debate over the power of the federal government. So, how much power the federal government has. It's becoming a thing that people are debating. People think that it's too powerful. The acceptable ways of pursuing international and domestic goals. So, how is the government pursuing its goals? Are they stepping across lines? And then the proper balance between liberty and order. So, how much liberty should Americans be expected to give up in order to stay safe? Is essentially what that means. So, some of these things we've talked about already, but I want to mention a couple of different things. So first of all, there's this debate of the presence of growing nuclear weapons. So many nuclear weapons are being built by both powers, and there's concern about this because they're building so many that the entire world could be annihilated, and that's a dangerous thing for people to have to deal with. And Eisenhower gives this warning about the military-industrial complex. This idea that and he does this in his farewell address after his last term as president. He essentially says, "Look, we're spending a lot of money on military, and we're almost becoming like a militant nation, to the point also to where our economy is becoming dependent on our military spending, and that's a dangerous place to be because of just sort of the precedent that is being set for the building up of all of these weapons, and now your economy is becoming dependent on them." We've already talked about strategic arms limitation talks, but just know this is an example of various arms agreements attempt to deal with the idea of too many nuclear weapons. So even in the Soviet Union, they're sort of recognizing that there are some issues with all of these nuclear weapons. Then there's this huge debate over the power of the executive branch, the president of the United States, with regards to foreign affairs. Truman had fired MacArthur when General MacArthur, who criticized Truman's handling of Korea, he just fired him. You've got the Gulf of Tonkin, where LBJ lied to the American people and then got Congress to give him a blank check to do whatever he wanted with regards to war. And that leads to, so this is an extreme form of power here given to the president. That will lead to the War Powers Act in response to this, in response really to Vietnam, and just how the presidents have gotten to the point to where they have all of this power over the war machine. The War Powers Act was designed to limit presidential power. So Congress goes from 1963, a blank check policy to the president, to in 1973, the War Powers Act to restrict the president's policy, or essentially he has to uh, tell Congress, give them warning about what he's wanting to do, why he's wanting to do things before he gets approval, and then they have to give him approval. Then we've got, don't worry about that because I've already talked about it a little bit. I've already talked about hawks and doves, so make sure you're familiar with that. I talked about the Tet Offensive, make sure you're familiar with that. And then the bombing of Cambodia was sort of an amping up of the war in Vietnam. And when American people found out about this, they were outraged. It led to protests across the country, and it led to the Kent State protest, in which I think there was 4 kids who were killed by the federal government, basically by federal troops in 1970 over their protests. And all of this conflict over our role in the world and presidential power, and then other things going on at home, um, it all leads to even more fear. And what you see happen during the 50s and 60s is this a new Red Scare develops. So we had one after World War One because of the fall of the Soviet Union, or the fall of Russia to the communists, and it became the Soviet Union. Now you have a second Red Scare. But people are seeing communists in every aspect of life. It leads to the rise of Senator Joseph McCarthy, who became famous for accusing people of being associated with the Communist Party without any evidence that they were. You've got Alger Hiss, who was an actual spy. You have Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, who were accused of being spies and were ultimately executed with the electric chair as a result of their espionage, giving nuclear secrets to the Soviets. So you do have some infiltration in American life. Joseph McCarthy became famous for accusing just about anybody of doing that. And the Federal Employee Loyalty Program was passed. It investigated the backgrounds of federal employees to make sure that they weren't part of these radical movements. A lot of people lost their jobs as a result of this. And you've got HUAC, the House of Un-American Activities Committee, which is restarted after World War II to search for communist influence in American life. They bring people before Congress to testify about what they know about other people being involved with the Communist Party and things of that nature. And it's just a real bizarre committee, a real bizarre time to for the United States with regards to how it's sort of just being accusatory towards the American people. Now, one important idea to keep in mind post-World War II is this concept called decolonization. Decolonization was essentially what was taking place throughout the world, where all of these European or American colonies had been established. Let me write that here, decolonization. That's not very pretty, but it doesn't matter. Decolonization is taking place throughout the world, where a lot of these European colonies or European powers who had colonies are losing their control over these colonies. So now these colonies, these areas in the world are sort of up for grabs. And there's two world powers who want to have influence over them. One particular place was in the Middle East. So that's what we're going to look at right here. So some examples in the Middle East. American support for Israel. The United States had supported Israel after World War II. The State of Israel was created so that all the Jews who had been persecuted would have a homeland to go to, and the United States becomes a supporter of Israel. And any non-communist regime, the United States was supportive of it, even if it was a brutal dictatorship. The United States wanted those people in power over anything communist related. As far as economic reasons for getting involved in the Middle East, access to oil. That's the number one thing here. And to be honest, that's probably the number one reason overall that the United States cares at all about the Middle East, except for Israel. I think that they would always have been a supporter of Israel. They're not really a great oil exporter to the United States or anything. But a lot of these other countries are, and the United States had a vested interest in making sure that it had access to oil. Some examples include Operation Ajax. Eisenhower used the CIA in 1953 to overthrow the elected Iranian government. It was two socialist communists. So Operation Ajax was the United States essentially overturning an elected government to get someone in power who they felt like was more pro-U.S. Don't worry about the Suez Canal. I do want you to know the Eisenhower Doctrine. The United States promised economic and military aid to any Middle Eastern country threatened by communism. So you've got Truman Doctrine. That leads to money being funded or money being sent to nations in Europe. And then you've got the Eisenhower Doctrine, where the United States is promising to do the same thing in the Middle East. Then you've got the Yom Kippur War. Syria and Egypt attacked Israel in 1973, and the United States came to Israel's aid with with military and economic aid. Then you've got, let's see here, the Camp David Accords. I want you to know those. 1978, Jimmy Carter will help negotiate. Israel and Egypt will sign a peace agreement. So throughout this time, the United States' major ally is going to be Israel. It even is through to today. And the United States from this point forward is going to be heavily involved in the Middle East, especially when you get into the early 90s all the way up to today. But we'll talk more about that on another video. Now, Latin America. This is going to be essentially Central America, the Caribbean, South America, Gulf of Mexico, any nations in those areas. This is where the United States is going to try to exert its influence over those nations as well, just like they are doing in the Middle East. The United States will support non communist regimes with varying levels of democracy. In other words, the United States doesn't really care if these regimes have democracy or not. What they care about, the main thing that they care about, is that they're non communist. You're going to see some examples here. In Guatemala in 1954, the CIA overthrew the democratically elected government in Guatemala because it was too socialist communist for America's taste. In 1959, Cuba is going to fall to communism, and that little nation is right off the coast of Florida, so it is strategically very important to the United States. The United States supported the Cuban dictator Batista because he wasn't communist, but Fidel Castro was. He led the revolution, and despite a little bit of help from the United States, Castro was still able to overthrow the Cuban dictator. Eisenhower is going to order an embargo on Cuba, and JFK will try this Bay of Pigs plan that we hadn't talked about, but essentially it was an attempt to overthrow the government of Cuba with Cuban exiles who had been trained by the CIA in the United States. They're sent back into Cuba to infiltrate, and the hope is that when they get back into Cuba and they start to cause havoc, that the other Cuban people will come to their aid, and in doing so, they'll be able to spark a revolution in Cuba. That does not happen, and then JFK does not send any help to these Cuban exiles, and it is a complete failure, an absolute disaster. And then you've got the Cuban Missile Crisis that we've already talked about, which is about as close as the United States and the Soviets came to war during the entire Cold War. And that's pretty much it for foreign policy. Thank you for joining me.